Hello and welcome to the My Dietitian Journey podcast. My name is Adam, your co-host and producer. With me, of course, Felicia Peraza of Peraza Nutrition and My Dietitian Journey on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, other places, other things. We're going to get into some stuff today for dietitians to be. What are we getting into?
We are going to talk about the Dietetic Internship and a little bit about the process, but more so about the rotations and what to expect.
So a little brief overview, I guess, of what you can expect going in, how to prepare, I guess, and what to look forward to. All right, what are we going to get into first here? What do you just want to give a brief overview of the process in general?
Yeah, just a brief overview of the application process for the Dietetic Internship. So you must be either a graduate of an accredited program with a DPD, didactic program in dietetics.
Say didactic?
Yes.
What's that mean? What's that word mean?
Didactic.
Why can't they just make things simple?
That's why I say DPD.
All right.
It's a lot easier.
DPD, got it.
Or be in the process of completing your accredited program. And then you'll complete what's called a DICUS application, which is the Internship Centralized Application System, and then register and pay for computer matching. And then you submit any application paperwork and fees for the internships.
D&D digital?
Yes.
Dungeons and Dragons digital? Cool. Love that. That's part of it. What does that mean?
I don't know. I actually was
D&D
looking it up.
digital?
I think it's just called D&D Digital.
All right. The D stand for something, I'm sure.
It didn't say on the website.
All right. So you had an internship just like every other RD. What was yours like?
So I did my program through Utah State University. It was a distance program. It was about 7 months long, which is pretty typical of most internship programs. My internship did have graduate program credits with it. So I was able to go back and then complete my master's after. But my rotations included clinical nutrition, which we're going to talk about each of those categories, community nutrition, food service. And it is important to note when you think about different programs and internships is that they're all going to have clinical, community, and food service, but some have extra sites. So they have like like some have an entrepreneurship one. Other ones might have like a specific long-term care and acute care, and then also outpatient care. So some of them have some variations, but they will all have these like core components with clinical, food service, and community.
Things vary depending on the program. I'm sure not everyone's going to do a remote internship the way you did, but it is a really good option. The big competitive ones sometimes are overcrowded and a little too competitive. Maybe a remote option's a better choice for people. I've seen some stuff on the dietitian subreddit about this.
Yes. So there's the distance programs and then there's on-site. And with the on-site programs, they're setting up the rotations for you. With distance, you have to find all of your preceptors and all the sites that you're going to be at. So there's a little bit more legwork on your end to find your sites before you apply.
So you're doing the arranging and you're putting your rotations together and everything like that if you're doing a remote program. And if you were doing, say, like a local one with like the big ones are Aramark and Sodexo, I think are the biggest ones.
Yeah, those are two big ones.
They assembled the program for you.
Yep.
Right.
So they tell you where you're going to go and when you're going to do each of the rotations. But they're super competitive. When I did my internship program, it was, I guess, 7 years now, maybe a little bit longer. And
7 years ago.
7 years
you did
ago.
The program.
And I applied to Sodexo and Aramark. I did not get in. But
despite working for Sodexo management at the time, even.
Yeah.
Getting referrals and stuff. Didn't matter.
And the individual who did the interview with me told me there was over 300 applicants at that time. So,
well, that number is not significant if you don't know what the basis is being compared against. So out of those 300, how many got accepted?
Oh, at that point, I think there was only 8 on-site interns.
That's the relevant. If it's 300 and 200 people get in, but if it's 300 people for 8 spots,
yeah,
kind of a big deal. In that case, other options might be a lot more practical.
Yes, and the distance programs often have a lot more spots in their programs. So, like, I think mine at the time for the Utah State University, I think it was 40 spots that they had available. So a little less. It's still competitive, but a little less.
But do you know how many applicants there were for those 40 spots? There might have been less than 300.
There might have been. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Either way, other options may end up being more favorable. So Overall, how did you prepare for your internship once you got in? Well, do we want to talk about the application process and how that all works? Because I know that there's a list and you have to put your preferences and like depending on which you prefer to do. Or are we going to get into that later, or do you want to get into that now?
We can talk about that a little bit. I don't want to go too far in depth because there's a lot involved in the application process, but the DICUS application, which is the Dietetic Internship centralized application system, that one is where you're going to upload things like your transcripts, your DPD director information. And then for my internship program in particular, I needed to actually have 400 hours of documented work or volunteer hours. So I had to upload that. And then things like your personal statement, your resume, any references, program designations and signatures, that's all through that DICUS application system. The computer matching is where you're ranking your internship placement. So like your first choice, your second choice.
Your preferences.
Yes, your preferences.
And you had the hours documented because you worked in food service in a clinical setting.
Yes.
You were a hospital, you were a dietary service, food service aide in a hospital, which allowed you to have easily cover that hours of documented work or volunteer hours.
Yeah. And they wanted actually a combination of different types of volunteer or work experience. So the hospital was great for like clinical and then also the food service aspect, but also with working I worked in a nonprofit, a YMCA, and that's where I got community hours too.
That's right. Did you put down your Habitat for Humanity stuff at all? Did that matter?
That stuff, yeah. And especially that was really helpful for the personal statement piece of it because I was not only a member of Habitat for Humanity, the chapter organization at Westchester University, where I went to college. Yeah. But I also was then like a public relations officer, and then I was president my senior year. And so having like leadership experience, and it doesn't matter if it's not related to dietetics, but having some kind of leadership experience
looks great.
Well.
It looks great for a lot of things. It looks great for getting a job. It looks great for applying to these internships. It will always serve you well to have volunteer experience. And this is the kind of thing you really want to get ahead of if you can while you're in high school. If you can find a volunteer opportunity in high school, but even in college, you're way better off getting ahead of this within your first couple years of undergrad, because by the time you hit that fourth year, you want to be done this. You want to be moving forward to the next things. You don't want to have to worry about scraping your hours together to hit these 400 hours verified.
Yes.
In your last year of college, struggling to do that. I do see people going through that where they're looking for a job to accrue relevant experience their second year of college. And the clock's ticking at that point.
Yeah.
That's about the latest I'd say you'd want to get into that comfortably. If you're not going to be working 40 hours a week, you might only be working like 12 or 16.
Yeah, the sooner you can start getting, the experience, the better.
Okay, so that was, I guess that was your application process and kind of how you went through it. So let's get more into your preparation and your thoughts going into it, and like actually after you got accepted and you knew what you were doing, what did you do to prepare for the internship?
So we're gonna go through more specifics, in terms of preparation for each of the rotations, but just overall, there was an orientation week that I had for my internship program, and most internships are going to have either a week or a couple of days or even one day with orientation. But generally, you're going to do a lot of pre-internship work, so before you actually get on site for these rotations. So I completed all the quizzes and the lectures that were supplied by my internship program. Based on whatever rotation I was going to start with, so I started with food service. I actually went back and read through my food service organizations book. And then I read through all the assignments I was going to be completing throughout, created like a mock timeline of when I might be doing the assignments in the rotation, and then got everything together in one place so I can easily reference not just the assignments, but also any notes that related to the rotation. So
cool. That's a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
All right. So that's all before you even got into your first rotation. There's lots of pre-work to do, assignments, homework.
Yeah.
So to speak.
It's usually stuff. I mean, it's stuff that's going to help you in your internship. So it's, if you do those ahead of time, it gives you a little refresher on stuff that you might not have, been thinking about in the last couple of months. So.
Okay. So your first internship rotation was food service management, right?
Yes. And so mine was a combined food service management and school nutrition education. So I actually did mine at a school district, but some rotations might
When you
be.
say at a school district, you mean you were at a school,
Yeah, I was in
right? You
one.
didn't bounce around from a bunch of different schools in a certain district. You were at one physical location the whole time.
I was housed mostly at one physical location, but I did go to like the high school and the middle school. So I did go into other schools in that district.
So it wasn't just a single campus. You went into different school systems within a district.
Yeah, well, it was one district, so it was Pennsbury School District. And then I was in there, I actually went to one of their elementary schools, maybe two actually. And then definitely their middle school, I was at that. And then their high school, which is actually 3 campuses.
Right. But the schools weren't affiliated, or were they? And does that matter? I'm just,
They were affiliated. It was, but I was working with like the contract food service management team that serviced all of them.
Okay, so it was a single school system in a particular district, and you worked with the contracted management team for that school system.
Yes.
Just to really hammer out what you actually did. So what was that like? What was your first day like? What did you actually do?
So I was lucky enough to start a couple weeks before the school year started, which was really helpful. So the first day, just, tour the facility, what to expect on a daily basis. That's pretty common for what you're going to experience for most of your first days in terms of your rotations. But really sat down with my preceptor, my first preceptor at the time, reviewed the assignments, a plan for how to accomplish them. And then they actually had new guidelines for the National School Lunch Program that were just being rolled out. So all of their menus actually had to get updated to fit the latest nutrition recommendations. So
it sounded like you kind of had, for your first couple weeks, because of the timing, you kind of had a couple weeks to sort of orient yourself to the school system, to the program, and get to know the staff and the I guess the process for everything. So you got an idea of what things were to be, and you were able to orient yourself to the system of service itself.
Yeah. And I think it was very lucky that they allowed me to come in a little bit sooner than the school year started, because otherwise they were really busy that day anyway when I first came in, because they were fielding all these calls from parents and they were getting employee training. They were putting food orders in. But the first, day of the actual school year starting would have been way crazier. So it was nice that I was able to actually go in a little sooner.
No, that makes sense. It's a little less jarring to learn the basics of something before it actually starts going, and then you have to learn by doing. There's some preliminary knowledge that's valuable to get. So that was not only your first day, but your first couple of weeks was really just getting your feet wet, orienting yourself with the facility and the program. What did you do throughout the rotation? Like, what were your tasks? What did you actually do? What did you perform?
So the school, they did a 6-week cycle menu for the school district. So I had to actually help, and this was, they were using a system called Primero Edge, which is basically where you input the menu items and then assigned specific menus for each of the schools in the district. And then it ran like a nutritional analysis to make sure you're meeting the guidelines. And then they would order based on, what the menu was.
So you're saying like order, like you're using some terms here. I just want to clarify, so you're talking about, there's a 6-week cycle menu. So week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, week 5, week 6. And each day had different meals. Mm-hmm. And this was input to a program, a system on a computer that computers ran this. It was a certain piece of software. And as you plugged items into the software, it would break out like macronutrients. And there were probably numbers in terms of how many meals were required per day, per week, per meal period, even. It was all broken out. And did that actually connect to the food ordering management system, where like a manager placed food orders with a company like US Foods or something?
Yeah.
That they would actually receive like pallets of food that would go. We're literally talking about like these schools have kitchens with like walk-in refrigerators and like storage rooms. It's just like a restaurant or something like that, where you have to order the food, store the food. There's that whole process, and you learned all of that.
Yep. So I had to observe and then participate in the ordering, the inventory, serving food prep, and then like temperature, sanitation, So everything under like food production, food service, purchasing, and inventory, that was all a part of this.
And you performed duties relative to those tasks on a day-to-day basis. Like you may have at some point even served food to the students. You may have been walking around with the clipboard, ticking the boxes for, we have a case of this on the shelf, the PARS 2, gonna order 1, like that sort of thing. You had an involvement in sanitation practice, observing employees, looking at the storage and the flow of food, it's called in the industry.
Yes.
So like you participated in a lot of that stuff to the point where you effectively learned how to manage a restaurant or like a kitchen.
Yes.
And it's important for dietitians to know how to do that, especially if you're in a clinical setting like a hospital or a long-term care facility, because essentially you are able to function as a food service manager in a pinch. And in some cases, it's a combined role where it's a dietitian and a food service manager, and they're the same role. And like the school you were at had that, didn't they?
So when they actually hired, so they had a food service manager. They had two food service managers, and they had a dietitian. And then when they hired the new dietitian, she had a combined role that included food service. I forget what her actual title was, but then also the dietitian piece. But,
there are combined roles where it's a food service manager / dietitian. I used to work for Sodexo. They have those positions. Sometimes that's a really good career option. It's a rough job if it's your first job. It is a rough entry level job. If you're in what's called a single TO account where you're like the only management personnel, and it's like a small place where you're the dietitian and the manager, that's got to be crazy, because then you're acting as the dietitian and you're also like making a schedule for employees and like ordering the food and managing the money. It's I don't know, that's probably a rough gig. But you did that for 13 weeks.
Yeah, so it was the food production side, all of the inventory, all that, and then also I actually did I had to do a research project where I actually implemented a recipe. So I had it taste tested with the kids, and then I put it on the menu, and then they did like an analysis to see, more kids chose it because they taste tested it ahead of time. And so like that was more of like the food service piece of it. And then there was also classroom teaching. So it was school nutrition education as well. So I actually taught a 3-day lesson plan for 6th graders. I also taught lessons in 1st and 2nd grade. I did in-services for the faculty, for the workers there, and not the faculty, but the food service individuals. And then administrative stuff. So like answering the phones in the office, which a lot of it was actually parents calling about allergies. So children with allergies and which menu items had those allergens.
Really good to be a dietitian in that case, or your experience is very relevant for that.
Yeah. And then school nutrition week was actually one of the weeks in my internship. So I dressed up in a banana suit the one day. And
I'm putting the pictures in the video.
I still had them. I was just showing my intern them actually.
You were a pea pod too at one point, weren't you?
I was a nice looking pea pod. And I handed out like fruit and vegetable stickers to kids in the lunchroom. And then I was an apple the one day, and that was really fun because it was like apple crunch day. So they handed out apples to a bunch of the kids, and then they got on the loudspeaker and like just crunched into an apple at the same time. So it was just a lot of fun, especially with the little kids.
Yeah, I guess the kids are fun to work with too, especially the younger ones. High school kids, meh, I don't know.
Yeah, they weren't as excited about it, but
too cool for that. Too cool for apples. All right, so any other weird things, interesting experiences, big takeaways, anything specific?
Well, that was my first rotation. And my preceptor, who was a dietitian, actually joined the Navy and left after my first 2 weeks that I was there. So that was definitely an interesting experience because they didn't have a dietitian for a little bit until they hired somebody.
So you were kind of it for a little bit there.
Yeah, and so they had this like national school lunch program. They were just using Primero Edge, and I had learned how to use it from the dietitian that was there, and then I found myself teaching people how to use it. It was just such an odd thing because normally you do staff relief and stuff at the end of your rotation, but not like 3 weeks in.
You got thrown right into it. Just trial by fire.
So that was
sink or swim.
That was literally what it was. And
heck of an experience.
I was also afraid because I needed to have a dietitian as my preceptor, like what was going to happen. But they did hire someone, and then I ended up, showing her how to use stuff, and then she became, my preceptor after that. But that was definitely an interesting learning experience. being in my,
heck of a way
first
to
rotation.
get your feet wet. You just learn some new software, and then you're teaching other people how to use it. When you said join the Navy, did they like become a sailor, or did they become a dietitian for the Navy?
A dietitian for the Navy, but she went through like the training
Basic.
and stuff. Yeah.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. So, that was food service management, and it was a combined like food service management / school district. Do other programs do that separately? Because I know Sodexo does clinical kind of like by itself, but do they do food service management by itself? Do you know if other programs do that differently, or do they always combine it with another specific thing?
No, so it's usually like food service, and then each internship has a specific set of guidelines as to which sites you can use. So some say it can be a school district, it can be, a clinical setting like a hospital or long-term care facility. My rotation just in general had that combined education piece with school nutrition. And that was something that was interesting to me and I wanted to do, but not every rotation is going to have like a school nutrition ed piece of it. But because I was in the school district and the rotation, that's what it was.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you were at the school district for food service management, or you were learning food service management because you needed a school district piece.
Yeah, so like you definitely do need food service management. It's just mine in particular had to be at the school district.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I used to have interns for like a week at a time when I was in management, and the dietetic interns, they would work with me to do part of their food service management stuff. But I assumed that it would always be in a clinical setting, but I guess it depends on the program.
Yeah, it does depend on the program.
All right, cool. So your next one, you did community nutrition, and that was 4 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like?
So I was at WIC, which stands for Women, Infant, and Children. And so that rotation, I was at a WIC clinic, and I was at one of their kind of headquarter sites. So it was a little bit larger. And so when I was there, I did a lot of like lesson planning. I did a lesson plan for the WIC clientele, and then also a lesson and a presentation, actually, and in service for the clinical staff that were there. So I actually did I talked about like media stuff. So what's new in the research and myth versus fact kind of things.
Current events?
Yes, that's a better term. Current events. And then counseling and documenting. So using the nutrition care process. So that was a kind of like the first part of the counseling piece that I was exposed to outside of like, undergrad when you learn about it. But being able to counsel. And then I did a community intervention actually assignment, which I had to address a nutrition related problem in the area and then, write a report on it. But a lot of it was more of the nutrition counseling, with the clientele.
So what was the preparation process like for this WIC rotation for community nutrition, and how is it different for your food service management rotation?
So with food service, learning about the National School Lunch Program, I found it really helpful to like print out charts for each of the grade groups and the requirements, like to be able to reference and go back to. Whereas for the community rotation and with WIC, learning about the packages, how participants get certified, issues that might arise with pregnancy and infancy, which most of the time you were seeing a lot of iron deficiency. So being able to just kind of brush up on like what WIC actually is, what kinds of things are offered in those packages, that stuff is really helpful just to get to know.
So just to clarify, before entering into the rotation, you knew what was coming. You sort of went out of your way beforehand on your own and reviewed information on a website, or did you have information available from your program? Like what information did you use?
Yeah, so for the food service, because you have food service management in your undergrad as part of the program. So that's something that I had my textbook and I had my notes. I just went back and like read through everything. For WIC, it was covered in the textbook, at least for me, but it was a very brief section. So I just went on their website. So if you're going to be at like WIC or a food bank or any kind of, community site.
Something government too. There's a .gov site for WIC.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. And you can check out all the information that's public.
Yes. And they go through all the WIC packages. They go through information. There's like tip sheets on there. So there's a lot of stuff at WIC. So like I grabbed a lot of handouts when I was there and like the trifold brochures to review. But it was nice going into it with a little bit of an idea of like what to expect and having the base information. And then I was able to print that stuff out. For me anyway, I had binders, but you can definitely use just like an iPad if you're able to bring that on site. But that was really helpful just to have already.
All right, side note, this came up on the RD2B subreddit, and I was talking to somebody about this. Do you recommend an iPad or some kind of small mobile device for your internship if someone's thinking about it? Because I suggested to this person, like my brother or your brother and I split an iPad mini for you for your rotation, and you took it everywhere and you used it for everything, and it was the first generation of iPad mini. You had it for like 6 or 7 years after, too. You used it for a ton of stuff. And somebody asked, should they get a tablet or an iPad for their internship? And I said, well, you get a little Bluetooth case. It's a laptop, a really convenient touchscreen laptop. You are right now using an iPad.
Yes.
They're very convenient devices. They're a little pricey, but do you recommend that sort of thing for someone going into this if they can afford it, if they're thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, if you can afford it, I think an iPad, like especially like a small version, the mini can be great to bring along with you. One thing just to keep in mind is the site that you're going to be at. You might not always have, maybe be able to carry it around. Like I found when I was in food service, having a clipboard with a paper, being around food and stuff like that was a lot better than having an electronic. So just think of your rotation site too, that it might work really well for like clinical, but maybe not so much for like food service. And then the other thing, with where I was at WIC, I was in a pretty low income area. And so they didn't suggest you walking around with a lot of electronics. So I kept most of my electronics in the back where the faculty for the staff were. And then when I was like out in the front where the clientele were and where they were doing the counseling and everything, I just had like a small notebook available.
Something to keep in mind. It's just a tool that you used that you found to be convenient for your rotation, but obviously some limitations there, depending on what you were doing. Okay. Any other specific tips or suggestions for your community rotation that come to mind?
So no matter what site you're going to be at, especially WIC, that's one of the ones that's I think recommended for most internships, at least in part. Sit with as many nutritionists, and they use the term nutritionist because not everybody there is a dietitian. Sit with as many as you can because they have different styles of counseling, and that'll help you when you go into clinicals and through your other rotations to just kind of see, how they handle those one-on-one sessions. And then definitely bring, a laptop or, your assignments to work on because for me, when I was at my WIC rotation, if it rained, nobody came in. So it was, 8
Like
hours.
nobody came in, like there were no guests or no, I don't know, the clients, there were no people showing up for appointments and stuff.
Yeah, most people, it was very sparse. So that was just something that, I'm spending 8 hours there. And so I might have had an appointment or two that I sat in on, but most of the time I was kind of in the back working on things.
So you had some downtime, so to be prepared for your downtime to use it wisely, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool. So that was food service management for the school district was 13 weeks. The community rotation was 4 weeks. So now we're going to get to the big meat and potatoes of your rotation here, the clinical stuff, which was the majority of the time. You had a clinical nutrition rotation that was 13 weeks. And then you had inpatient clinical was 6 weeks and clinical staff relief was 2 weeks. Was this all at the same place?
So it was 13 weeks total, and then I had 6 weeks that were done at my inpatient clinical site. So I was at a hospital, Grandview Hospital, 200-bed facility, and then I was at a long-term care facility for a couple weeks, and then an outpatient facility, and I was at an outpatient facility that focused on mental health and eating disorders. So there were 3 separate sites. However, that's not always the case for clinicals with rotations. A lot of times you just have one clinical rotation at one site, and it may not be separated into all of these different sites like mine was.
Okay, so just to clarify, it was 13 weeks total. 6 weeks were inpatient, 2 weeks were clinical staff relief, and the remaining 5 weeks were outpatient?
3 weeks were outpatient, and then the other 2 weeks were staff relief at the inpatient facility. So it was really 8 weeks.
Okay, I think I did. I'm not sure. Either way, it was split amongst a variety of things. You weren't just sitting in one place doing one thing for these 13 weeks. Not to say that you were necessarily doing the same thing over and over again for your food service management, but you were within a specific school system in that district for those 13 weeks. Whereas in the clinical rotation, you were at three different facilities that weren't necessarily related.
Yes.
One was a 200-bed hospital, and then another, the long-term care facility. Those two places are very different.
Yes.
Things are very different in a hospital compared to a long-term care facility. They're both healthcare, but one has just like an aging population for long-term care. They live there. Hospitals are obviously people don't live in a hospital, generally speaking. And then outpatient is that like it's not like a ready care or like a fast care, but it's not quite a hospital either.
Yeah. So the mine was outpatient, but the way I did mine was they had outpatient because I was at a split facility. So there was one side was eating disorders, the other side were those who had mental health conditions, and they had like an adult side and like a teen, young adult side, and the eating disorder side had inpatient. And then they also had a day hospital and outpatient. So it was like a combination. So I was able to actually experience a lot of different stuff while kind of being covered under this outpatient, while not all of it was technically.
Okay. And just to clarify something that I touched on earlier. So we were talking about how you had your food service management piece in a school district. And I was mentioning that when I was a patient services manager at a hospital, I would have interns work with me in food service management, but it was in a clinical setting. So it still covered the food service management piece. And that doesn't really change. If you're at a school district or a long-term care facility or a hospital, you're still, the food safety and sanitation stuff doesn't change.
Mm-hmm.
The flow of food doesn't change. Working with frontline staff, like a lot of that stuff is the same regardless of it. Even if it's like a catering or retail setting, it's still the same. So if you learn this stuff in somewhere that's not a school or a hospital, you're still getting the same information, and the standards are the same across the board.
Yes.
Just to clarify, because that may have been confusing earlier. I'm not sure. So you were your next rotation was after community. You went to clinical. You started out at the hospital, right?
Yes, that was my first one.
Okay, what was that like? What did you do on your first day?
So first day, again, kind of like the orientation to the facility, the hospital procedures, protocols, and then I also had to learn their EMR system with all the patient information.
EMR,
electronic medical records.
Cool.
And it was actually really cool. One of my preceptors for that rotation gave me like it was like a scavenger hunt where I had to find information in the EMR for a patient. And that was really helpful to actually be able to get into the system and find the height, the weight, medications, allergies, and just navigate where everything was located.
It seems like an efficient way to learn a piece of software with lots of different variables that you have to find and access on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
So you were oriented to the facility. You had some information and sort of introduction to the hospital's procedures and protocols for a variety of things. In this capacity, you were acting strictly as a dietitian, correct?
Well, dietetic intern, but yes, just as the dietitian.
Yeah, just the dietetic side. No food service management, no staff relief or anything like that at this point.
Yes.
You were strictly working with like the dietetics, so like I don't know, tube feedings and stuff.
Yeah, so that was a part of it. So every day I would come in and research, any new patients that needed maybe a nutrition initial assessment, and then also any follow-ups for the day. So we typically did, patient rounds on the patient floor where there was a lot more education and counseling. And then we also did ICU rounds. So I had split rotations, which was, more interdisciplinary with other healthcare professionals, where you would look at labs, do ventilation calculations, calculate their energy requirements while they're on the vent, and then also writing tube feeding or TPN, total parenteral nutrition recommendations as well. So it was both.
So when you did patient rounds, what does that mean? What are you actually doing? You're going from room to room, assessing a patient's information based on a variety of variables and their, their vitals and some other things, and you're actually interacting directly with that patient as a dietitian. You got the lab coat on, you're in there with your clipboard or whatever, and you're speaking directly to the patient about their situation and how their diet influences it, and you're giving recommendations and stuff like that. Like, what does that actually look like?
Yeah. So when it was on like the, regular patient floor and not necessarily like in the ICU, you would get a consult for somebody. And so it might be for, a carbohydrate controlled diet. So for diabetes or renal diet or congestive heart failure. And so you'd have this consult, you look up the information, figure out some information about the patient themselves, and then provide education. So you go into the room, introduce yourself, and then actually provide nutrition education. So educate them on, a carbohydrate controlled diet or a low sodium diet or a low fat diet. And so you would provide the education. And sometimes they were receptive.
I was just about to ask, how did that go? Because I could imagine that had some variance in the way it was received.
It was, sometimes you'd have a really great patient who was very
receptive
and receptive, and then others who were falling asleep because they're on a lot of medications. And,
anyone ever tell you to shut up and get out?
I've just had a lot of people who told me that, I'm just going to go home and eat bacon anyway. And
not taking it seriously.
Yeah. And so being able to provide, I would just still kind of give them the handout, but they did, they had outpatient along with, and they did home care. So the dietitians that were there did inpatient and they rotated, and some did outpatient and the home care. And,
when you say home care, would they literally go to patients' homes and provide instruction and education in their home?
Yep. Yeah. And I went with
the hospital would send them out to do that?
Yes. And I actually went with a couple of the dietitians out to do the home visits. And so that, normally in those settings, the patient was a lot more receptive, with outpatient or home care than inpatient. But it was kind of like you didn't really know when you walked in the room what you were going to have.
So I didn't know that hospitals did that. Is that normal?
I don't know. I mean, I was actually surprised with the home care, and it didn't seem like they got a lot of consults for that to happen. Like, I think there was certain, specifications that they had to meet in order for someone to go out. And I guess, at the time, have that be billable. I didn't ask all those questions when I was there.
Well, the hospital's taking care of it. It's not really your prerogative. You don't have to worry about that. But it is pretty relevant for private practice in terms of direct experience.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't think of it at the time, but it was absolutely a really good experience to see that and to be able to have the different styles of how you might communicate with somebody given 5-10 minutes in a room or in their home, being a lot different. So.
Okay. And then you had some stuff with case studies, and you had to do a presentation of something.
Yeah. So I had certain case studies. So this was combined with like a research paper that I did for my internship.
But did you present to someone at the hospital?
I presented to the dietitians, which was not very many in the area that I was in, but I actually presented on probiotics and antibiotic-associated diarrhea. So it was a very long presentation, but that was actually what I ended up doing my presentation on. So.
I was kind of hoping you presented to like the nursing staff or the C-suite or something.
No, but that's something I think that they were doing. They had
the
them
C-suite being like CEO, CFO, those folks.
Oh, yeah, they did do education with the nursing staff, but I think they rotated it every so many months that they were doing that.
And you're just preaching to the choir, presenting to a group of dietitians about dietetic issues. But it's part of your internship. And then I guess they critiqued you and talked to you about stuff afterwards.
Yes, yeah, asking a lot of questions about the more heavier science kind of stuff.
All right. So anything interesting in terms of cases with patients at the inpatient spot?
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing with inpatient clinical, you learn in your undergrad a lot of different conditions and diseases. And it's just an inpatient, I just found there to be so many things to learn. So I learned, like, there was a lady who had her stomach removed and her intestine was stretched to create a pouch. And so I had to end up calculating tube feeding recommendations for her. I got to be a part of a swallowing evaluation. So that was really cool. We're actually was in the radiology room.
Oh, like with speech therapy and stuff?
Yeah, so that was really cool. It was the patient and like technicians, and they would give the patient like a small amount of a food, so like applesauce, cottage cheese, with barium in it, so they could see it. And then they would have a screen where you would literally see the food enter the patient's mouth and then the esophagus. Both of the patients that I ended up seeing had the food get stuck in the esophagus. So this was poor swallowing abilities. And so one ended up back on a no food by mouth diet, and the other one was actually allowed to have pureed foods. But it was just so interesting to see that because you just,
you wonder, as a former food service employee in a hospital, I used to wonder where those little cups of like fruit cocktail and applesauce would go. And there was one that went to speech therapy and one that went to radiology. I'm like, why do you guys need this stuff? What are you doing with it?
That's why.
That's what they were doing. That's fun.
Yeah.
Did you do speech therapy at all at that place?
No, I don't think that was
there's
just
some food involved in that or whatever. Yeah. Just curious.
um
So what else came up that was weird?
other stuff was, like I got to see x-rays with, things like a collapsed lung or fluid in the lungs and blood clots. That was, very interesting. Um this was one of my favorites. I had this like must have been like 80s or 90s year old patient who told me that my name sounded like a nice soft kitty, so that was fun.
Whatever that means.
It was just
All right.
exactly.
Yeah, you meet a lot of characters when you work in a hospital and you interact with the patient population. You meet some interesting people, and they're in a weird place too, and kind of in a vulnerable state. So you get a lot of variance in terms of the way they interact with you.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's something to be ready for. That's something you probably don't think about if you're just, you're coming into this and you don't have any experience working in a hospital setting. It was one thing that we used to have to stress to the frontline staff so much is that these people that are patients in a hospital, they're not ready to, they're not that they're not ready, but they're in a foreign place. And there's people coming in, poking and prodding them, and they're kind of, a lot of people are afraid.
Yeah.
So you're meeting people when they're not at their best. And of course, you never know what you're going to get when you walk into a patient's room. Be ready for anything and be open-minded.
That's exactly. I mean, and that's what a lot of my preceptors had said during that time is that, sometimes you're going to go in, you're going to have someone who's not going to want to change. They're not going to want to hear anything you have to say. It's your responsibility to go in and be able to provide the information and then leave it with them, but really not push them because they might not be ready for change. They might be on a bunch of different medications. They might be in a lot of pain, and you're maybe sometimes the last person that they want to talk to. Or they may have just gotten bad news before you walked in. So always keeping that in mind to, have empathy for the patients and not just be about trying to give them a handout, necessarily.
Yeah, they're in a hospital. It's a pretty serious place where just like you're not aware of what people are going through. So it's a tougher place to be and operate within probably than like maybe a school where it's just a bunch of happy kids and the worst thing that happens to the 13-year-old is that they broke up with another 13-year-old or whatever.
Yeah.
No one's receiving news about, terminal cancer or anything like that. So it's a more serious environment. What else?
I got to have a patient that had a Whipple procedure done, which I didn't know at the time was like not very common. But
what's a Whipple?
So it's this very complex operation that they remove the head of the pancreas and the first part of the intestine, which is the duodenum, the gallbladder, and the bile duct. And it's used to treat tumors and then other disorders of like the pancreas, the intestine, and the bile duct. But it's very serious and it's I guess not very common. But there was a patient, I remember when that came up that everybody was like, a Whipple, and
So you were there for what was a pretty rare procedure.
Yeah.
That most people don't get to experience. Weird stuff like that.
Yes.
That's cool.
That, and then like, it was just, again, you kind of learn about some of this stuff, but you don't actually see it firsthand or interact with patients. But I worked with a patient who was quadriplegic to figure out calorie needs with, high protein for wound healing, or be able to like see patients come off of like a ventilator and then be able to eat and, swallow normally. So that was, again, I was just exposed to a lot more than I was thinking. I was thinking like, oh, just diabetes and heart disease. I mean, that was certainly a part of it, but with other complications and then all of these other different conditions.
So not for anything, but it's becoming more apparent to me talking to you about this stuff and listening to what you went through that having experience in a clinical setting was probably the best way to prepare for your internship, because it sounds like there's a bunch of whiplash there in terms of exposure and new experiences. Everyone goes to school, or not everyone, but like most people have experience at a school in that setting where you walk into a school and it's usually like a warm, familiar place.
Yeah.
And you feel comfortable. And, compared to a hospital,
yeah,
a lot of people don't spend time in a hospital. It's a very different setting, and you're spending 13 weeks in both settings for you in this case, but it's a dominant portion of your internship. In either case, you're going to spend a lot of time in a clinical setting as a dietetic intern. If you don't have experience in a hospital setting, no matter what it is, food service, housekeeping, volunteer work, whatever it is, if you have your 2 feet inside of a hospital for hundreds of hours, you will feel more comfortable and better able to like absorb this stuff and operate within the setting, because it is a bizarre environment if you're not used to it.
Yeah.
It helps to get used to it. Okay, so what resources did you find helpful when you're doing your inpatient stuff?
So one of my preceptors at the inpatient clinical, gave me a booklet with a bunch of equations that were really helpful. So like calculating calorie needs and protein, and then also tube feeding protocols and the formulas, and like when to use each of the different types of formulas. So like I knew nothing about tube feeding formulas and all the brands and all of that. And then like calculating ideal body weight and fluid needs. So those would all be things that your preceptor might not give you, but I would definitely suggest having like a little cheat sheet available. Also, lab values, knowing what it means to be high or to be low, and then also common diseases. So, like cirrhosis, diabetes, cardiac, renal failure, pancreatitis, and then like the associated diets that would go along with them as like a quick sheet. And then, like we were talking about earlier, like a small clipboard or a small notebook. And I would suggest something that would fit into a lab coat, because you're going to be wearing generally probably a lab coat for inpatient clinical. And so being able to have like pens or pencils and then like a little notebook.
A little spiral notepad, like a vertical one that you flip over and you write, like you can hold in your hand, stuff like that. Probably helpful.
Yeah, that was super helpful. And I could just throw it in my pocket and be able to have my hands free and doing stuff.
I think all the dietitians that I worked with carried one at the hospital. Yeah, I think especially the clinical nutrition manager, she had one in her hand like all the time. But okay, so then the rest of your rotation was in long-term care and outpatient.
Mm-hmm.
What were they like? They were significantly less in time. I imagine not quite as intense.
Yeah, so long-term care was actually so interesting because I worked with a male dietitian, and the field is predominantly female. And so
that's pretty novel.
Yes, it was very novel. He was really awesome to work with, but it was pretty similar in terms of like I had case studies to do. We did nutrition screening, we did charting, but a lot of the clientele was a lot different in terms of like older.
So can you differentiate your experience between long-term care and outpatient specifically? So like, what did you do in long-term care?
So long-term care, they did have menu planning there. So the dietitian also was in charge of the food service. And so they were in charge of planning the menus for the residents there. And then also they got a lot of like supplement consults. So like for Insure or things like that. My outpatient was totally different because I was primarily in the section where they were working with eating disorders. And there was one dietitian that was in that section. And so she worked with the day program where individuals would come in just for, like the morning to afternoon. And then she did outpatient consults. And then she also worked with the inpatient clients who, again, were struggling with eating disorders. So totally different experience being between those two.
So the long-term care facility was like, a home, quote unquote, like colloquially speaking, that's what it's referred to as, like that's what people talk about when they talk about like they send their parents to a home or something like that. They're talking about a long-term care facility. This was a separate facility from Grandview Hospital that you were at. Okay. And then the outpatient care portion, was that in the outpatient wing of a hospital, a different hospital?
Yes. So it was a behavioral health hospital. And so one side was mental health, one side was eating disorders, and the mental health was separated with, again, adults and children. And then it also had an outpatient section of the eating disorder. They probably had one for mental health too. So it classified under my outpatient, but it was in a behavioral health hospital.
Okay, and those two portions were like 2 or 3 weeks each or something like that?
Yeah, they were really short. Outpatient for me, and when I was working with the eating disorders, those with eating disorders was 3 weeks. So it was a little bit longer, but really not a lot of time. And we did, some nutrition counseling and education. I didn't really do much counseling because it wouldn't be, I don't know the right word to use, but it would be pretty unethical for me to be providing like nutrition counseling to those who are struggling with eating disorders, because there's a lot that's involved in that. So
yeah, that's more mental health.
Yeah, and so
I would think
the dietitian that was there had been there for a while, had lots of training and supervision before working there, and so I chimed in on certain stuff and did like some like nutrition ed type things that were more fun, to be kind of like promoting health and wellness a little bit, but it was done in a very different format than, inpatient was. So a lot of watching and listening.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So then I guess that was the last thing you did was either your outpatient or your what do you call that? The
Long-term care.
yeah.
Yep.
So
Yeah, those are my last two.
and then when you finished, that was when you were kind of wrapped up with that portion of your education, and you sat for your exam not too long after, right?
Yeah, I took 5 weeks, I think it was, in total to study. But throughout my internship, I actually was making note cards for the RD exam and studying throughout, not seriously studying, but making the cards and just kind of being familiar with, stuff that I was learning in the beginning of the rotation that I wasn't thinking about later in the rotation. And then I spent about 5 weeks just sitting down and really studying the content before taking the exam.
All right, cool. Yeah, and then, you were done. All right, so any final words of advice for future or current interns for their dietetic internship?
So definitely prepare before your rotations.
Preparation is key.
Yes.
An ounce of preparation is worth a pound of whatever the saying is. I don't remember. It's a pound of cure. Not really relevant for this, but whatever.
But gather information about where you're going to go. Just get a little bit of insight about the facility. Review your assignments. Review through your notes. But do know that you are going to learn a lot during your rotation. No one expects you to be at the dietitian level when you start. So ask a lot of questions.
Your head's going to be spinning.
Oh, yes.
There's no way to really prepare for it before you get in there. It's like reading a book on how to drive a car versus driving a car, way different experience.
Oh, yes. And, just ask as many questions as you can about, patient procedures, nutrition assessments, take the initiative when you can for projects or tasks, even if nobody's watching. And then, still be flexible because things will change that are completely out of your control. Like my preceptor, I didn't know was joining the Navy, or, your preceptor might have other priorities where often when I'm working with interns and I have a schedule, we have things to do, and then all of a sudden something happens and I need to jump right on it in the business. And so, being able to handle change, like that's sometimes I could tell with interns who are like flustered versus others who are like, okay, I'll do this. And they're, prepared and just kind of roll with it. So those are some big things. Also, admitting when you don't know something. So ask for help. If you don't know, don't struggle through it. Again, you're learning a lot and there's a lot that you're processing. So ask the questions, but know when to ask for help too.
Yeah, don't worry about being the whiz kid that has all the answers and impresses everyone. That's not you don't have to do that for this. This is your time to learn and be a student. You are still a student. It's not a classroom anymore. You're in the field. Mm-hmm. But this is when you ask questions and you absorb, be a sponge, It's a great opportunity to get your feet wet and then kind of learn what you like and dislike and what you're comfortable with, because I imagine for you, that was your internship was the thing that made it pretty clear to you that you didn't want to do clinical, right?
Yeah. And I was actually pleasantly, I knew I didn't want to do clinical because that wasn't the style that I wanted, where it was, again, that short kind of education. I didn't really like doing tube feedings necessarily. Some people really enjoy, those, but that was something that I was pleasantly surprised. So always go in with an open mind as to how much I was going to learn about all these different interesting cases. And I was just expecting it to be like diabetes and heart disease. And it was totally just not that. I mean, okay. It was that and more.
So you expected it to be more stale and less involved and more about calculating tube feedings, and your preconceived notion was inaccurate, you found, because it was a wildly different experience that had way more variance. Right?
Yeah, it was a constant, and every day was different. There was always at least one new patient that was something interesting about them. And so that was really cool to see. And so, again, although I knew I didn't want to do clinical after that rotation, I did have a different level of respect, I would say, for it, because I just, wasn't expecting what I had.
and so with all the detail we've gone through, I think it's pretty obvious why it's suggested that you don't work during your internship, because it's really involved and really heavy, and you're going to need time outside of the hours you spend in the facility going through things to try to absorb and learn this stuff on your own time as well. But you worked weekends, didn't you?
I did. And what was flexible about my job was that I didn't really have I had set hours on like Saturday mornings, but I didn't have like these, crazy hours where I really needed to be in at a certain time. It was a little bit more flexible than, most other jobs out there. But with that said, you mentioned something about, I can't think of what you just said, but it just made me think of something.
Well, like bearing in mind how much time outside of your actual hours you'll need?
Yes. One thing to keep in mind is though, when you go into your rotations, you're going to have like checklists and things that you have to do during the rotation that your preceptor will sign off on. And, I mentioned bringing assignments for downtime, but don't expect to be able to complete all of your assignments during your rotation. Like you're there, to learn and, also be that your preceptor will probably assign other things that don't relate to what your internship has on a checklist, but will still help with your experience and learning in the field. So you will have to spend time outside of like your 8-hour day working on assignments or doing modules that you might have for your rotation. So that's where working a job might not be feasible if you're doing a full-time internship.
Yeah, you were hustling when you were in your internship. I was living in an apartment, and you were there a lot with me, and you were working when you weren't in your internship. You were in a book. You were looking through notes all the time, practically.
Yeah.
And you worked weekends, and it was convenient for you. I've seen it come up where people ask, like, what should I do if I have to work? And like, ride share or like Uber Eats comes up, something flexible, because you don't know what you're going to get into.
Yeah.
The hours, like what you're going to end up actually doing. You, at one point for your community rotation, you had a bit of a commute.
My community rotation, I did have a little bit of commute, but my clinical rotation, I had an 1.5-hour drive each way, and that was if the weather was okay. So if it wasn't snowing or raining.
Yeah.
But you're expected to be there, so it's you can't really say like, oh, I have to work. I can't be at.
Yeah.
It's not how it works.
I mean, you're doing a full day on site, and then your commute is 3 hours. I mean, it's only for like 6 or so weeks or whatever it was, but still, you're expected to do that.
Yeah.
So make it your utmost priority, and I guess it's unfortunate that this is the case for the field, but you kind of have to put earning money on the back burner while you're doing this internship. It's fortunate that it's not a 5-year residency or something crazy like that, but still, it ends up being very time consuming. You were busy as all heck.
Yes.
For that whole period. We saw each other because we practically lived together at that point, but it was you were busy.
And one thing too, as you're like, if you're looking at rotations and internship programs, some of the internships do offer part-time, options where it's going to be obviously a longer internship, but it'll be part-time. So that might be something if you do need to work, but most of them are going to be full-time. So, planning ahead for that time being kind of all about the internship.
Save some money going in. Have a little bank account if you can.
Yeah.
Save some money. Work a summer job every year of college. I don't know. Be frugal. It's going to help if you're not able to work a lot during the internship. All right. Do we want to wrap it up here? I hope this was helpful for anyone who's going into a dietetic internship or wants to know what to expect, or maybe is in the middle of it and looking for ways to optimize their experience. Any questions, of course, you feel free, if you're on YouTube, to leave a comment for us. Felicia and I are both active on the subreddit for dietetics, r/dietetics and r/RD2B. They're good communities for this sort of stuff. If you have questions, people are looking to provide help. But again, we will provide resources in the description and show notes for this stuff. And feel free to reach out to us, or Felicia, really. I may answer on her behalf and ask her a question, and you'll see me reply instead. But feel free to reach out with any questions or concerns. And that's going to do it for us here at My Dietitian Journey. Have a swell day, and we'll see you next time.